welcome you all to our 20th, it's incredible, 20th year of the Michael P. Crowley lecture series. And I think it's really tonight, you'll all agree, it's exhilarating, it's refreshing, it's exciting to finally be out in person, smile at each other. And I owe all of you a special thanks that persevered through the 2019 series Zoom lectures. It just isn't the same, I know. And Dan Titus, by the way, just so you, I think you know this, but he has preserved all of the lecture series on tape, and they can be called up on our website, newportirishhistory.org. You can dial in and get all the past lectures. Well, tonight is special in the way that several members reminded us over the past year and a half that we omitted a whole portion of the history of Newport. We kept talking about the Irish contribution in building this great city. And we have omitted the black contribution, the African heritage contribution in building Newport. And some of it, along with the Irish, and that's what you'll hear about tonight. And I want you all to know that, and I think you may have seen it, but this event tonight is being sponsored by Ginny Pitsley in memory of her husband Bill and her son Jay, who passed within the past 2 years. And they were ardent supporters and are ardent supporters, and it's so generous. Thank you, Ginny. You're out here somewhere. Can you raise your hand? Thank you so much. Personally, I vividly recall standing outside the Interpreter Center with Bill in December 2018, watching the Christmas open house with him, and standing there watching the men's Hibernian singers and smiling and talking about it. We had a great time. But thanks again so much. A few administrative remarks. We hope in the future to grow the capacity here. We have about 100 tonight, maybe a little bit over that have signed up. And then we have a whole slew of people on Zoom that are also watching. We hope to grow this to 170 or so, it might be 180, COVID dependent. This room will hold it, just a question of when we're going to be allowed to expand the opportunity here and get those people that are now on Zoom back into the room here with us. Next weekend, Saturday the 18th, we have two things happening. One at 5 p.m. at AOH Hall. I'm sorry to say it just reached capacity right before I come in here tonight. That's a good thing and a bad thing for me. We're honoring Jack Curran in the front row here and Peter Martin in the front row as they you'll have the opportunity to hear a little more next Saturday. Now, 1 hour prior to that, at 4 p.m., everyone is invited to the Barney Street Cemetery, where we're going to dedicate signage, a historical sign similar to the ones that are on Bellevue Ave. You know the ones I'm talking about there at a 45-degree angle. And it's a pictorial history of Barney Street Cemetery. And that was brought to us through the generosity of Carol Lepley and her family. Thank you, Carol, so much. In memory of Steve Lepley, who was one of my real counsels on the board. And so I think it's a wonderful tribute. It's in a great, if you haven't been there, show up next Saturday at 4 p.m. Barney Street and Mount Vernon Street. It'll be a short, formal dedication, and it's going to be a nice event because that's a little sanctuary in the middle of that neighborhood. About our presenters, quickly, and I probably don't need to say too much since I think you're all familiar with these two presenters, but a little bit of background for people that might be new. Dr. John Quinn is our very own on our board. He's a graduate of Georgetown, Notre Dame twice, MA and PhD. They call them double domers, John, is that right? Double domers at Notre Dame. He specializes in Irish history, American ethnic and religious history, and the students love him. I read some of the write-ups there. Good. This is his 10th talk. He gave the very first one in 1992. So, Keith Stokes, to my left here, the Vice President with the 1696 Heritage Group, a historical consulting firm specializing in the African's unique American heritage across the whole African diaspora. He was educated at Cornell University and the University of Chicago, a widely respected lecturer. He's earned numerous local, state, and national awards. He's held leadership positions, so many in the public and the private sector. He was executive director of the Rhode Island Development Corporation, and as you all know, executive director of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce, where I had the privilege of serving on the board for 5 years, and I hate to say this, it was 20 years ago now. So let's have a round of applause.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm particularly excited for this because much of this research has been in collaboration with a number of historical institutions across the state, but also the opportunity to work with historical institutions across the African diaspora. I've had the honor to spend time in Curacao, Barbados, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Ghana, never at a beach. I haven't seen a beach yet. But in archives and working with scholars and histories and seeing actual primary, secondary documents that directly relate to Newport and Rhode Island in the 18th and 19th century. So this story is a world story, and it's a story that really connects all of us here in Newport. I'm quite proud to deliver. I'm now going to have to speak and also manage slides simultaneously. So next slide. And I think it's important for me to recognize the fact that all of the images that you see come from the collections of Newport Historical Society, Rhode Island Historical Society, several private collections. Most importantly, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. We have some exciting news in a few months. They're the oldest Black Heritage Society in the nation, right here in Rhode Island. We've got some very exciting news. And one of the things that I'm proud of is we've spent the last year, despite COVID disruptions, digitizing and making available first time primary ancient fragile documents that now will be available online to the general public for scholars and researchers that we never had before. And again, we have some of the deepest and richest records that interpret the stories of Africans and later African Americans in America as compared to anywhere in the world, the diaspora, right here in Rhode Island. So the images that you see and the story that I provide you really come from those great institutions. Next slide. What I'm going to do is walk you through about 300 years of history in about 30 minutes or less. And really set the stage for John so that you can understand how Africans arrived, how they organize themselves, and most importantly, how they begin to build lives for themselves as free citizens, enjoying all of the rights that any free citizen should have, most importantly, the right to participate in government. And one of the things that's remarkable is the fact that the enslaved Africans that arrived here, we now know, arrived here from what is today Ghana or northern Nigeria, at the time called the Gold Coast. So one of the unique aspects of African arrivals in Rhode Island specifically, in generally New England, is they're not coming from different aspects and different locations of West Africa. They're almost coming in some cases, not only from the same regions, but from the same tribe. So once they arrived here, unlike anywhere else where Africans were enslaved, West Indies, South and Central America, they shared language, they shared religion, they shared political and tribal systems, and transported all of that with them when they arrived here. So today we recognize them not only as enslaved, but immigrants. They were forced immigrants, but they were immigrants. And immigrants, as you know, bring with them their language, their culture, their religion, and then they transfer that and build that, and it evolves in their new lives in a new world. Well, the Africans themselves did very much the same. And one of the things I was able to do working with the city and province and the state last year is put together for the first time a comprehensive database of all documented slave vessels and voyages connected to Rhode Island. So now what we know is there were at least between 1705 and 1805, at least about 934 documented voyages. What we also know is 72% came from Newport. So when you talk in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, transatlantic meaning ships leaving Rhode Island ports, largely Providence, Newport, and Bristol, and then traveling to West Africa, largely the Gold Coast, today Ghana, and then taking enslaved Africans through the Middle Passage and landing almost exclusively in the first part of the 18th century what is today Barbados and then Jamaica, and then back to Rhode Island. So we know that now. Newport dominated that trade. Newport merchants dominated that trade. In fact, Newport was the most active, largest, successful slave port in British North America. After the American Revolution, Newport, as we know, is largely destructed, destroyed, left really not intact as a maritime economy because of British occupation, and Providence and Bristol stepped forward. But for the most part, Providence and Bristol were not sending ships to West Africa. After the American Revolution, they're sending them to the West Indies, largely Cuba and Puerto Rico, and then back to the Americas. So what we know as a transatlantic slave trade, it's Newport. And Newport was involved in sending at least 100,000 Africans, mostly to the West Indies, but some of them eventually making it back to the shores of Newport. Next slide. And I'm not going to talk anything more about slavery, because slavery, as my grandmother told me, Newport's how we got here, but it tells you little to who we are as a people. Now I want to talk about the people. Newport, by the 1790 census, had the second largest free black population in Rhode Island after Providence. And it was about the fourth after Boston and Philadelphia. But what's most important is when we talk about the end of slavery and the slave trade, we think about the Emancipation Proclamation and Abraham Lincoln at the end of the American Civil War, when in fact there's a first emancipation. At the time of the end of the American Revolution, as that's winding down, beginning with Vermont in 1777 and followed by other now United States across New England and the Northeast, each and every one of them would have a gradual or a permanent abolishment of slavery by the end of the 18th century. So by the end of the 18th century, there are tens of thousands of free Africans, not African American, not people of color, not BIPOC, people for the most part who were either born directly from Ghana or northern Nigeria, from the Yoruba people, from the Fanti people, from the Shanti people, or they were second generation, possibly third generation. They saw themselves as Africans. Everything that they did, every institution they created was called an African school, an African society, an African church. So they saw themselves as Africans in America. And what's most important is that these free Africans, by the end of the 18th century, places like Newport, Providence, Boston, Philadelphia, are starting to organize. Whereas most other Africans in America are enslaved in the American South. Here, particularly in New England, you start to get these free pockets of free people. Next slide. And what's important about these free people in organizing is, and remember, they're forced immigrants. Even though they came in the worst circumstance, they survived the Middle Passage, they survived enslavement, they still maintain their African identities, language, culture, religion, and most importantly, their political organizations. And one of the most important dates in early Africans in American history is November 10th, 1780. A group of free African men in Newport come together. They come to the home of Abraham Casey, who's a chocolate grinder. His home would have been today Memorial Boulevard West or 11th Street for us old Newporters. The home doesn't exist anymore. And these African men came together and formed for the first time in world history a free African Union Society. Now, how do we know this? Because the minutes and records still exist at the Newport Historical Society and Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. These free African men organized for the first time for three very important purposes. One, they created a census where they took every demographic information they possibly could, how many Africans in the town of Newport, how old they are, what's their occupation, what's their religion, children, marriages, divorces, anything. And this becomes one of the most complete demographic understandings of an African community in early America. The second thing they wanted to do was to build a school. It would take a few years, but later, by 1808, they established one of the first free African schools, free meaning African-owned, operated, and taught in America. This isn't Philadelphia, this isn't New York, this isn't Charleston, South Carolina, it's Newport, Rhode Island, and the building stood on what is today School Street. The third thing they wanted to do was to go back to Africa. It would take them a few years, but many did. And again, they went back to Africa because their general belief was we still see Africa as our home continent. We still are connected to our tribal origins. We want that connection, and we feel that we have to have that option to leave. And it's a fascinating debate because you literally, over the next few years, this Free African Society in Newport literally reaches out to their friends in Boston and Providence and Philadelphia and say, could you join us in forming these African societies? And between 1780 and 1790, each of the communities formed their own African society. They shared minutes, they shared information, and most importantly, they shared a vision of what it would be to be an organized, free African community in America. And what's exciting for me being a history nerd, this isn't 1880, this isn't 1850, this isn't the Civil War, this is in the 1780s and 90s. In Boston, Newport Africans are talking to a man named Prince Hall. Prince Hall would go on to found and create the first African Masonic Lodge affiliated, today the Prince Hall Lodge. In Philadelphia, they're reaching out and giving money to two African men who would later found the first free African Methodist Episcopal Church in America and the second African Episcopal Church. What's exciting to me, again, being a history nerd, is these are Africans talking amongst themselves, organizing amongst themselves, and creating the nexus of the first free African schools, first free African churches, first free African civic organizations in America are all emanating from a place called Newport, Rhode Island. Next slide. And what's really neat about that is that each and every one of these African institutions would go on and create one of 4 or 5 of the first free Black churches in America. As I said in the case of Philadelphia, a Reverend Richard Allen, who establishes the AME Church, would establish the Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. His counterpart, Absalom Jones, I have family members who are part of this church, would establish the African Episcopal Church at St. Thomas. We're still Episcopal after centuries and centuries because of those connections. In Boston, the African Meeting House, which still exists on Joy Street, would later evolve into a Baptist church. And in Providence, the first free Black church in Rhode Island, the Cogniz Street Baptist Church, would evolve from the African Meeting House. Later this month, I'll be at their Founding Day celebration, and I actually have the names of the founding African men and women who were kind of kicked out of the First Baptist Church and decided that's fine with us, we'll establish our own church. And they created their meeting house school, and today the Cogniz Street Baptist Church. And in little old Newport, the Africans would come together and the society would evolve into the Union Colored Congregational Church. Their building that they completed in 1880 still stands at 49 Division Street. Next slide. So these Africans are now Africans in America. They established churches, organizations, and societies. And in Newport's case, it's the Union Congregational Church. This is a Newport Historical Society image that actually came from my great uncle that comes from about 1910. And at this church, the Black churches of that time were the center of not only religion, but social, civic, political organization, education, anything that was going on in the community happened at that church. You had services on Sundays, but for the rest of the week, everything else was going on. And why were these places so important? Because in the 18th and 19th century is one of the few places as a person of African descent that you could assemble and not look over your shoulder. Because there was always that concern of people not wanting you to organize, people not wanting you to advance yourself. Their issues were real, and even including in a Newport or a Providence or a Connecticut or Massachusetts. So the sanctity of having your space that you can go walk in, close the door, and talk about anything that you felt free to talk about. So this Union Congregational Church became the center of the Underground Railroad during the Civil War era in Newport. It became the center of political debates. In fact, Rhode Island public schools were segregated. If you happened to have a Black child in Providence, Bristol, and Newport before the American Civil War, they had to go to a private Black school. They could not participate in public school. And here in 1853, Providence and Newport, men and women gathered, organized, and over the next 15 years, they would fight for and finally achieve integrated public schools. But the very nexus and beginning of that debate was in this church and in these confines. So this church became the center, as did Philadelphia, Boston, Providence, and elsewhere, of everything in the Black community at that time. Next slide. Now, I want to talk a little bit about where Africans live, because that's always interesting to me, because I hear terms like they lived in ghettos, they lived in segregated areas or separate areas, and that never was really the case in Newport. And before I talk about the shared spaces with the Irish community, the evolution of school lands into Kerry Hill, the West Broadway, it's important to recognize that Africans that arrived here were usually under the age of 12. Now, even my own ancestor that arrived in Philadelphia, Newport, he was 8 years old. But what's most important is children were a higher commodity here because children would be trained in the trades. You know, this is Rhode Island, this is New England, bad soil, bad weather, no cash crops. We're not growing any plantation, large commercial activity here. So for the most part, most enslaved Africans were brought over and trained in the trade skills. There's silversmiths, there's stonemasons, women are seamstresses, sailloffs, they have dressmakers. My own ancestors, an 8-year-old boy, is trained as a Windsor chairmaker and a later cabinet maker. So the point is, and I'm not saying that's good or bad or different, that's the New England economy and the demand at that time. If my ancestor had landed in Charleston, South Carolina, he would have been working on probably a rice plantation. And God forbid, if he ever went to the West Indies, he'd have a very short lifespan working on a sugar plantation. But here in New England, it's a different market economy and different demands for skills. So Africans here have access earlier to education, to trade, and even cohabitation. Most Africans as children lived in the same household as master and mistress. So what we call a very close interdependent, not integrated, that's a 21st century term, interdependent living because of these very closely shared spaces. So when people ask me, where did Africans live in Newport in the colonial period? Everywhere. Those that are in Quaker households are living in Easton's Point or the Point neighborhood in the Quaker community. Those that are with the Sephardic Jewish family are living on what is today Washington Square and up Turtle Street and Broad Street, Broadway. Those in other households are living in those households. But one of the most interesting aspects that begins by the 1780s and 90s, you have free Africans, many of them with trade skills, many of them with the ability to buy and own homes. They become a part of a new investment opportunity to expand Newport, which begins in the latter part of the 18th century, where the town actually purchases land and begins to create what are called new lots or a new town between the areas of Warner Street, Pond Street, and Marble Street, and Broad Street. Today, what we call properly West Broadway. And that area at the time was centered around a tannery. And the reason a tannery was there is because Pond Street, by the name, had a large pond. And it ran right down what is Marcus Wheaton Boulevard, and then it seeped into River Lane. If everyone, your old Newport, the old bars, that little River Lane alley actually has a river. And I always remember Biggie Corn with Yesterdays would go down his basement and get flooded all the time because it was sitting right on top of the river there. But in any case, the tannery was there. The town decided we don't want a tannery. It's smelly. It's just not a demand for that market. Let's just seize that land, take it, and replant it. And the decision was to subdivide it and sell it off as lots. And this new town, by the end of the 18th, early 19th century, became a place where people, tradespeople, who were particularly working on the waterfront, were building homes and living within that area. And that whole area was actually, by the 1820s, had a significant number of African American property owners. And we have lots of information. In fact, Cato Brindley, this is his marker that's within Godswill Acres section of the Common Burial Ground, which is today the oldest and largest existing enslaved and free African burial ground in America. Not in New York, not in Providence, not in Boston, but Newport. What's most important is that this area of West Broadway, by the 1840s, with now the German and Irish immigration, you have Irish, John even knows this much better than I, but the Irish, as they're arriving, you see them working at Fort Adams, they're working in the coal mines. I have a great aunt that had stock in the coal mines in Portsmouth. Not really good coal, so I don't think it was a lot of return on investment, but she did. But as the Irish would arrive, this early Irish were beginning to live in this new town section. And as we begin to look at descriptions in newspapers, we start to hear it be called Kerry Hill. And some of you might help me here, because I have not found that primary document that says it was officially named Kerry Hill. I find people referring to it and such. But in any case, you start to see this nexus where Irish tradesmen and laborers particularly are co-located and living in this West Broadway neighborhood. And by the end of the 19th century, you now have Portuguese and Cape Verdeans and Jews that are now living. Anyone who was a working class, laboring class person, you had a very nice cottage or home right within that downtown area that gave you direct access to walk to the waterfront in the days when we had working waterfronts. So that's the shared space. And what's fascinating about that shared space is that people were living side by side with each other. They're working side by side with each other. And in public schools, their children are side by side. It's this interdependence. And it worked. In fact, if we looked at most of early America at that time, everywhere where you had large black enclaves, there were race riots. 2 in Providence, 3 in Baltimore, 7 in Philadelphia, New York every other week, it seemed. That entire Gilded Age area by post-Civil War, there are race riots. There is never a case where race riot is identified in Newport. Now, I'm not here to say we're better or worse than those communities, but for whatever reason, this shared space, this interdependence, which goes back to the times of even slavery and post-slavery, people kind of figured out not to get in each other's way. We didn't let race and ethnicity and religion get in the way of just prosperity and living. Again, not to say that we're any better, but it seemed to work. Next slide. So I hope I set the stage for how people arrived and such here. I now want to talk about the political agenda and suffrage activity. One of the interesting things about Africans being tradespeople, being actively engaged and organized, African men had the right to vote by the end of the American Revolution up until 1822. It was then stripped away from them by the General Assembly, which created a significant consternation with African men in both Newport and Providence. They petitioned. In fact, they sent a petition that stated, "You're taxing us, and we have no representation in government. Didn't we fight a war for this?" In fact, they write, several of our grandfathers had fought for the Rhode Island 1st Regiment and fought for this, and were not able to vote. The General Assembly determined that, we're going to take away the taxing you, but we're not going to give you the right to vote. We're not too comfortable with having you vote, particularly when we have immigrants arriving and other non-natives. We really want to limit vote to native-born Rhode Island Americans. So you are the outsider. And this was a great challenge because the free people of color in Newport and Providence are organizing nationally around this issue. From the 1820s, over the next 20 years, they're entirely focused on winning back that right to vote. Because they're taxpayers, they're contributors, they're significant members of communities, and particularly Newport and Providence. And many of them go back 3 or 4 generations, even earlier than some of the white leadership. But they didn't have the right to vote simply because of the color of their skin. Next slide. And it would take an opportunity called the Door Rebellion. And the Door Rebellion is a fascinating history, particularly from the African heritage perspective. The African heritage leadership in Providence and Newport, particularly Providence, worked with Thomas Door, wanted to be a part of the People's Convention, and his vision that anyone should have the right, any male at the time, he still had some things to do, but any male should have the right to vote and not be tied to owning land or property or being foreign or not foreign. They should have a right to full citizenship. And Thomas Door believed that, and he invited several African-American leaders to come to the People's Convention and state their case. In fact, Alfred Niger, a barber and a prominent founder of the Cotton Street Baptist Church, asked to be on the executive committee, and he petitions to present a petition to state that we will join you as free African heritage men in Rhode Island so we can create this large nexus of people who are sitting on the outside and not able to vote. And the vote was taken of 46-18 to exclude African Americans. Thomas Door pleaded, saying it's the wrong way to go, it's not the right thing to do, but they were excluded. So the African American community in Providence decided we need to do something. And as now this People Convention is starting to moving towards revolution and possibly armed conflict, the African community in Providence came together and formed the African Grays Militia and backed the state. And by backing the state and putting down the Door Rebellion, African Americans were males that had at least, I think, $134 in property value could now vote. So one of the most ironic issues is that African Americans won back their right to vote, but they did it strategically by separating themselves from other oppressed minority groups and politically aligning themselves with the majority in power so they could simply gain back this benefit. Next slide. One of the most interesting aspects of this process is that there are a series of African American leaders, which I'll set the stage in closing, and then really turn it over to John, that began to have a sense that this access to basic citizenship that we won back as African Americans, that we deserve so dearly, has to be a universal right to anyone, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity. I mean, we're fighting for our freedom as racial minorities, but we have to recognize that now there's other oppression going on in this state. Not all African Americans believed in it. Their general sense was, let's take care of ourselves and not worry about it. We have to compete for jobs with Irish, with Germans, with Portuguese, with Italians. In Providence, in northern part of the realm, we're competing with Swedes and Poles and French Canadians. We don't want to work with them, but there were several men who believed in a universal right of freedom. And both these men are very planted in Rhode Island. Next slide. And I want to point out the fact that these men, before I introduce you to them, worked hand in hand with a larger white community. One of the things that's been remarkable for me in my research is the fact that the amount of progressive hand-to-hand leadership and working in the 19th century, particularly in Newport, over issues of race. This is something from my family collection that comes from 1873, and it's a group of white and black leaders in Newport. It's a who's who of clergy and political and such, and you see the names there, old Newport names, Brinley, Slocum, Higginson, they're all there, and they're all coming together and having an event for Thanksgiving to raise money to send a Newport delegation to the Colored Convention in Washington, D.C. And we have a number of these flyers and pamphlets like this where, again, this is 1873. I mean, 1873, the Klan is at an all-time high in the South. Jim Crow laws are creeping out of the South into the North. But here in Newport, there's this unique, not better or worse, but this unique level of belief. Maybe it goes back to our founding on the religious freedom and such, but there's this belief of universal equality for anyone, regardless of their background, that permeates very early. It starts to pick up steam during the Gilded Age. Next slide. And the two men I want to introduce you to is George T. Downing and Reverend Mahlon Van Horne. George Thomas Downing is probably one of the wealthiest black men in 19th century America. He is also recognized as one of the greatest political and social justice leaders next to Frederick Douglass, Senator Charles Sumner. And then Reverend Mahlon Van Horne, who's my ancestor, would go on to become one of the most important religious leaders and also, most importantly, political leaders. He's Martin Luther King before Martin Luther King, because he's simultaneously preaching politics and religion from the pulpit and using the pulpit as a platform to create a more morally just society for all people, regardless of race, religion. So these two men are Renaissance men for their time, because they're thinking not only about what we need to do to support and advance our people, but most importantly, advance all people. And in their writings and discussions, as all people are advanced, we all benefit. All ships rise with the tide. So let's talk a little bit about these two men. Next slide. Quickly, Reverend Mahlon Van Horne, he's born in Princeton, New Jersey. He goes to college at Lincoln University, and he's brought here to be the minister of the Union Colored Congregational Church. He's brought here by George Downing, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and some other prominent Newporters who wanted to bring a real firebrand young minister with a political appetite who would come and not only raise up the community, but also be able to fast forward the political system to get full engagement and enfranchisement of all people of color. So he was brought up for that purpose. Van Horne, as I said earlier, was very much in his personality similar to people that you see today as Martin Luther King, W.E.B. Du Bois, a scholar, a man of the cloth, someone who was a Renaissance man at that time. And again, people tend not to think that Newport or Newport people would have that level of leadership. Next slide. Van Horne becomes very prominent in his life. He becomes the first person of color in 1872 to be a member of the Newport School Board. In fact, his daughter becomes the first black teacher in 1902. His son is a graduate of the normal school after Rogers High School, becomes the first black dentist. But most importantly, being on the school board, he really shepherds the opportunity for not only black children or African-American children, but for immigrant children to have equal access to rights, to support, for textbooks. He immediately wanted to sit on the textbook committee because he wanted to make sure that every child, regardless of where they went to school in Newport, would have access to textbooks and learning. He felt that learning was an absolute essential component to citizenship and active citizenship. Next slide. They then organized for him to become a legislator. And in 1885, led by Governor Wetmore, by George Downing, and so many others, he became the first man of color elected to the Rhode Island General Assembly. And he became an immediate part of the Republican leadership, the Abraham Lincoln Party Republican leadership at that time. I have to qualify that. But in any case, he becomes an immediate leader. In the following year, he leads the effort to pass one of the earliest civil rights bills in Rhode Island that allows and engages anyone to have rights regardless of their race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. Rhode Island becomes one of the earliest states to embody and ratify consistent civil rights. Next slide. And even later in 1898, this is 19, should be 1898, President McKinley appoints him as one of the first African-American general counsels, these general counsels for the Danish West Indies during the Spanish-American War. He is such a significant figure, next slide. He literally is going on with Frederick Douglass in his speaking circuit across the country and speaking about the importance of access, citizenship tied to education, moral stance, and religious connection. And both he and George Downing are consistently talking about universal rights for all. They're stepping out of the race issue and squarely into the issues of newly arriving immigrants, and anyone and everyone should have the right of full citizenship. Because again, their belief is that all ships rise with the tide. He would talk about that and write about that in his writings. Next slide. And in fact, one of his most favorite writings that he wrote in 1887 called The Negro in Rhode Islanders, Past, Present, and Future, our family actually owns his original letters. And then we've transcribed them, and the state archives now have a piece, and we have a piece. And when he writes this, and if you don't see it, I just want to read this one piece that he talks about. There can be no question as to the purposes of God when we consider the history of any particular section of this country. The human family was looking for a field in which to expand into a broader and brighter life. Protestantism in a simpler worship was a burden that weighed upon men and women who migrated to these shores. The Catholics who came to North America were aggressive and wide awake, but found themselves surrounded with a dominant new spirit of civil and religious liberty. And then he goes on to talk to the fact that what makes Rhode Island special is that we were the first colony and the only colony that embraced anyone and everyone, regardless of their religious affiliation to a king or a queen or a royal governor. And that now needs to advance into now other social, political systems. Because this is our mandate, this is our opportunity. So he's one of these few Black scholar religious leaders that's talking about universal freedom and universal rights. And again, doing this in the 1870s and 80s, 50, 60 years before the 20th century, we have this discussion. The next man, the final man I want to talk to is George Downing. George Downing, as I said, is an entrepreneur. He's quite wealthy, he's quite well connected. When he arrived in 1845 to Newport from New York, his father, Thomas Downing, owned the largest oyster house restaurant in New York at that time. So George came here, arrived here, trained in the African schools in New York, and he would become a serial hospitality entrepreneur. He would buy an entire block of early Bellevue Avenue, today we call the Downing Block. And in that block, he built a 4-story hotel, a Secret Hotel, which the Secret was destroyed by fire, then he rebuilt. He ran catering businesses, barbershops and such. He also used money and leverage to bring other Black entrepreneurs from New York, Washington, Boston to come to Newport to take advantage of this fast-growing summer cottage season. In fact, if I could bring you back to 1870 to Bellevue Avenue from K Street to maybe say the Travelers Block, most of the businesses were Black owned then. Most of the hairdressing or barbershops as we call it today, dressmaking, all of those intelligent businesses. Now, intelligent businesses back then were employment agencies. And they were hiring people for the summer work and such. And what's interesting is that there's still a bit of a segregation in Newport. The colored workers, as we were called at that time, are largely living in colored rooming houses, what is today the top of the hill. Brindley Street and Elizabeth Street, all those big homes back there and such. The A&E Church went there after it moved from Johnson Court. So a large number of people of color owned all those big properties on that top of the hill area, and then running down to what is today Memorial Boulevard. So when you think of Du Bois Street, all those streets were largely African-American enclaves. Williams Street, parts of Division Street into the hill were all enclaves and such. And George Downing had a very hand in that. He was bringing people up. He set up finance companies. Next slide, please. He set up finance companies. He was politically connected. Charles Sumner and he were joined at the hip. Lincoln and himself were joined at the hip. He received a great political appointment by being the operator of the House of Representatives dining during the entire Civil War. So he not only made a lot of money in the catering business, he had catering businesses in Washington, Boston, Providence, and Newport. But he also had the ear. He would sit with legislators during the height of the Civil War and talk about issues and had a hand in Reconstruction. And he believed having access to these equal rights, he would bring back to Rhode Island. In fact, he led the effort for the integration of schools. He led the effort of striking down interracial marriage laws. He led the effort to fully integrate the state militias. I mean, he led those efforts on a personal basis. And on a national level, next slide, he in 1869 would lead to form a colored labor union league. Now, this is kind of interesting because I have several ancestors who were part of this meeting. And George Downing leads this effort. And in the effort, this is just one excerpt of what he's talking about. He's talking about colored and white laborers united together. He's talking about if we unite together, we will build the best workforce that America ever had, but will also be fairly compensated. This is an endorsement of unions. This is an endorsement of organization in the post-Civil War. And George Downing felt very passionately that all people of color, along with all white laborers, should have the right for equal wages and equal access. And that's fascinating to me as a history nerd because this is going on in 1869, and not New York City, and not the coal mines of West Virginia, but right here in Newport, right here within Rhode Island. George Downing would lead that effort. Next slide. So I just want to end here to say that when we talk about the evolution of equal rights, and I'll talk a little bit about this. When we talk about the evolution of equal rights and fair rights, you have to understand that almost all equal civil rights that we have today in this country stand on the shoulders of largely African heritage people. Because it begins by the abolishment of slavery, and then it follows almost immediately by stripping away restrictions based on initially race, then later ethnicity, and then later religion, and then even today's sexual orientation. So the things that we sometimes take for granted today had a starting point, and much of that starting point is vested in the early African heritage community. And it's led by men and women, such as Downing and Van Horne, that we're all very proud to now be able to interpret their stories. I have to say this, because everyone asked me about this. This is a African-American men's club in Newport, and they're called the Ugly Man's Fishing Club. I'll do this for you. My grandfather, George Barclay's there. My great uncle, Reverend Van Horne's there. Reverend Jeter's son. It's kind of a who's who. They were formed in 1898. In 1898, Bailey's Beach is completed, and African-American men in Newport are doing well. They're prosperous. They're college educated. They want to do the things of leisure time during the Gilded Age as anyone would want to do. They want to fish, they want to bike, right? They want to dance, they want to do all those things. So their general feeling was that I don't think Newport private clubs are going to allow us to be members. And the inside joke for this group was, and the reason they called themselves the Ugly Man's Fishing Club was that, well, if they're not going to accept us in these white organizations, it can't be because we don't have education or wealth or training. It must be because we're just unattractive. So what I'm saying here is that they made a decision. Rather than protesting or worry about what they didn't have, they simply said, let's just do with what we have and do it with people we want to associate with. And Newport had its own black tennis club, had its own bike club, they had social clubs, they had a progressive literary society established in 1872 with its own library, the Union Congregational Church. Not because they wanted to segregate themselves, they just simply wanted to make sure that they and their families and their children had the same access to all the educational and social opportunities, despite the world not ready to catch up. Now, I will tell you, in that particular debate, which is a discussion about women's suffragette, my grandmother and great aunt went to college. So all that I can say is that I'm sure my grandfather and my uncle had the answer to that question if they were going home that night. That's the only thing I can say in the research I've done. And then the last slide. And again, about 30 minutes, a lot of history. The great news is that we are working very close with the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, our Newport Historical Society. Later this year, we'll have online and virtual programs and tours as we start to digitize these records. And if you haven't heard, we're very proud. Governor McKee last month signed into law. Rhode Island will now have the most comprehensive African heritage history curriculum in the nation for all K-12 schools. And it'll be a partnership of our historical societies. Rhode Island College will be leading teacher professional development and training. And we've got this really neat young man that I can't announce in Newport will be a part of this. So we're very excited that what you heard here is the tip of the iceberg, and there'll be educators and institutions much better than I. They'll be able to present this story and interpret this story and why we're so proud of living, working, and worshiping in Newport. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to
Wow.
was so interesting and informative. I was trying to take notes as you were talking. I have to admit to a little bit of jealousy since Keith did that all without a single note card. I had to have a script. So. Well, anyway, as Mike has said, it's great to be back in person. It's cool, and then also have people on Zoom. And so yeah, thank you, Mike, for your intro, and Keith for the wonderful talk, and also Keith for being super flexible, because this was at least the third date I think we had with this. We kept changing the date as we kept trying to go over regulations. And yeah, I want to thank our friend Janine Pitsley for her generosity making this possible, and Dan behind the screen here. Dan's always such a big help, especially tonight, because this was more complicated doing the hybrid, so Dan's really worked hard on this. And then finally, I want to thank Vicki Johnson, because Mike mentioned, back in the fall of 2019, before COVID, ages ago, when we had our Touro Synagogue session, Vicki came up to us and said we had to do the African American Irish thing. And I remember saying, I think Mike and I both said, oh sure, Vicki, we'll do that. And I was just kind of a complete blank. Nothing was hitting me there that night. And actually my second thought was, gosh, if we come across material, it might be really unhappy material. You know, just as Keith mentioned race riots in different places, and I thought, oh God, because when I think of the Northeast and Irish Americans and African Americans, my first thought is the Civil War. I think of 1863, I think of the draft law that was passed as the North was looking for more troops. They imposed this draft law in the beginning of 1863. They put a $300 exemption into the law, so you could buy a substitute if you had $300. How many Irish do you think had $300 in their pocket, right? Not a single one. And so they really felt targeted by this law. And of course, the Irish had just suffered really heavy casualties. They had this Battle of Fredericksburg, terrible suffering for the Irish Brigade. So they're already in a bad mood, and then they feel targeted. But then, of course, they then take out their anger on African Americans. So if you're familiar with the New York City draft riots in July, terrible riots, over 100 people killed, and it's Irish going wild and blaming black people. So they're trying to, attack African Americans, burning down an African American orphanage. So it's a grim story. And of course, Boston had a draft riot too, much smaller, led by Irish women there throwing rocks at the draft officers. And Boston's had its racial troubles too. I mean, immediately just think of earlier troubles before the Civil War, and then I think busing in the 1970s, right? You have all the Irish African-American tension. So that was, I guess, my second thought with Vicki afterwards. I was like, oh gosh, I wonder what we're going to find if we start doing this. Well, of course, I have to say I put the thought out of my head because suddenly it was COVID. And at least for us at Salve, we were teaching with masks on and with students in front of us and then other students on the screen who were maybe watching us. I don't know what the students on the screen were doing, and I could never quite figure out the technology. And I was calling Dan, saying, some lights flickering here. So I put it all out of my head, and then sometime last year, though, I was doing my own research, and I just came across this article about a big Irish celebration in 1885, and it said, George T. Downing in attendance. And I thought, that's kind of funny. What would he be doing at an Irish rally? And I just figured, well, he's probably a polite guy, got a ticket, and was like, I'll go to the Irish rally. And then there was reading about a St. Patrick's Day celebration, and it said, George T. Downing in the audience. And then the third one, and after I came across the third Irish event, that George T. Downing was this prominent person at the rally, I said, oh, there is a story here. So going back to Vicki's question, there definitely is a story here in the Gilded Age. And as I started to pursue it, I found, and this goes along with what Keith's saying, it's an encouraging story. It's a story of cooperation. It's a story of respect between two communities that I describe as outsiders. These are people kind of on the margins here in the Gilded Age, WASP-dominated city, right? You think of the Vanderbilts and all the Astors and the Golettes, all of the summer community. These two communities are kind of on the margins and trying to navigate and trying to give each other a helping hand. So that's kind of the story I've found. So the connections I found start with Father James Coyle. And Dan, I think we've got a slide for him. Doesn't he look young? Everybody looks younger and younger. But he arrives in Newport in 1885. St. Mary's Church had been growing rapidly, year after year, especially during the summer months. And so Bishop Hendricken decided to set up a new parish for the north side of Newport. So this would be St. Joe's. Coyle was a young priest, born in Ireland, full of energy. If you see his dates, 1850, he's 34 years old when he gets to Newport. Well, he was anxious to get started, so he didn't want to take the time to buy property and build a church. That would take some time. So he wanted to get a pre-existing church and take that over. So, Dan, so do you all recognize that? Yes? Okay, St. Joe's, right? So that's the Mill Street, right? And that was the Unitarian church, right? But the Unitarians had then moved up the hill and built that massive stone church, right, on Truro, 1881 with the John Lafarge stained glass windows, right? So now this is vacant, right? And so Coyle thought, okay, I'll take that. He didn't like it at all, too small, but then he finds another Protestant church that is on the market that he likes better. Now, you guys recognize St. Joe's? Those of you guys who are any of St. Joe's parishioners, you realize there's 3 different St. Joe's, right? So this is St. Joe's number 2. Okay, all right. So luckily for Father Coyle, the people there at Zion Episcopal, that was what it was called, had decided that they needed to downsize. They moved to the north side of town, Rhode Island Avenue. And just to confuse everyone, they renamed their church. They call it St. George's. So they move, and so they're out. And of course, if you're not confused yet, it's got a different name now, too, Crosspoint. But over by Newport Hospital. Well, so 6 weeks on Mill Street, and then 1885, he settles in here on Washington Square, right in the heart of town, and he really likes it. And he builds a rectory for himself now. So that's like, it's not like the Inn on Washington Square or something like that, right? That's his rectory. It goes up in 1887. Well, younger, more energetic than the pastor at St. Mary's, whose name was Dr. Grace. Dr. Grace had some health problems, and so most of the Irish energy is going to come from St. Joe's rather than from St. Mary's in the 1880s. And I said Coyle was born in Ireland, but he left Ireland when I think he was 9. He was just a little kid, but very fiercely interested in Irish affairs and what was going on in Ireland. Well, in the 1880s, Charles Stewart Parnell was having great success in promoting Irish home rule. And I think we got a slide for nice picture of him. Well, Home Rule was the campaign to get the Irish a parliament for themselves back in Dublin. And if you're familiar with Irish history, they did have one at one time, and they lost it, and so he wants it back. So this would give Ireland a considerable amount of freedom from the British, right, if they could get their own parliament back. Well, Parnell, very powerful in Irish Parliament. He controlled a big block of seats, such a big block that he could decide who the Prime Minister would be. He could say, oh, no, you're done. I'm going to go with you. So, kind of the kingmaker there. Well, so Coyle's familiar with this, with Parnell's power, and he wants to support him. So he organizes a fundraiser at the Opera House, which was just down the street from St. Joe's. And these are some good postcards that Dan found. I thought these are really great images. I particularly like the second image, because you can really see how close the St. Joe's Church was to the Opera House. And of course, my thought was that the Opera House was just for concerts. Right? Anyway, but that's wrong. Opera House built in 1869. It's all sorts of cultural things, lectures, all various events, concerts. But this is really the cultural hub. And for Coyle, he's right next door, right? And so he's going to start organizing things. Well, so Coyle invites a friend of his, a priest from Worcester named Father Thomas Conity, to come to this event for Parnell, to raise money for Parnell. Conity is a rising star. He's going to become the first bishop of Los Angeles. He's going to be sent out to California. But Coyle also wanted to invite anybody who he thought was a VIP. So he sent these tickets out to people. So the mayor, the ex-mayors, everybody from the Naval War College. That had just been set up the year before, so any of the professors all got invites to the Irish event. But then he wanted to invite the top business people, so of course George Downing is one of the people who gets a ticket, and George Downing is there. So a big crowd comes. They say the Opera House could hold 1,000 people. Doesn't that seem massive? Right? And so Coyle reports at the end of the evening that $1,000 had been raised in one night. And I was trying to do, you know how you can convert money into present money? I don't know if I did it right, but it said 28,000. I don't know if that would be, but anyway, whatever it is, $1,000 in 1885 was a big chunk of change, right? So a big deal. Well, Following year, Coyle plans a big St. Patrick's Day parade, but then he gets another big lecture, and this man is a guy named Michael Davitt, and that's him, and he's really the, co-leader with Parnell in the Irish Home Rule movement. Close associate, he'd been lecturing all throughout America in 1886 in the big cities, Chicago, New York, Boston, and somehow Coyle got him to come to Newport. Now everyone's noticing his appearance here, right? That he's missing an arm, right? And I think he had a remarkable disposition, right? So he was born in Ireland, brought with his family to an English town where they worked in a factory, and at the age of 11 he lost his arm in a factory accident. And he said that was a gift. He said, they pulled me out of the factory and I got educated. He said I never would have been educated if I had kept working, and so he had an amazing way of seeing tragedy as a kind of a gift. So, so he comes. The Newport Mercury's writer noted that Coyle was trying to get all the Irish societies to come out in uniform before the Opera House event, and to march and to have a fireworks show. But the problem was it was a snowstorm. It's December 1886, and all that gets scotched out. But Davitt still made it to Newport and delivered what the Newport Mercury said was a thrilling discourse on Home Rule's prospects to a packed house, which included Councilman Patrick Boyle, and we talked about him before. I think he's on my next slide there. Henry Jeter, who was pastor of Shiloh Baptist. And Keith just mentioned Henry Jeter a little bit. So we got Henry Jeter, and then we have Patrick there too. Is he there? Okay. Yeah, they all have these mustaches, don't they? And you see Henry Jeter, 40 years pastor. Does that sound okay? 40 years, and then Patrick Boyle. I think I just said frequent mayor, and he's in 16th mayor. So anyway, as I said, the first time I saw that Downing was at an Irish rally, I thought that Coyle had sent him a ticket, and he said, I'll walk down the hill from my house and go to the Opera House, whatever. But now, when I saw him at the St. Patrick's Day parade, and then this time, he came through a snowstorm to get to this, right? This was a snowstorm, he's still there. So then I realized something's going on here. He must be dedicated to this Irish cause. And I have a theory, and which I can't quite demonstrate, but I think it makes sense. And I wonder if Frederick Douglass had an influence on Downing on Ireland, because they knew each other very well, as Keith said. They were friends, and in fact, Douglass had lectured in the Opera House in 1873, and he stayed with the Downings in Bellevue Avenue and came down the street. So they knew each other very well, and we've had talks about Douglass and Ireland before. But Christine Keneally, I think some people probably have seen her, but Douglass was in Ireland during the potato famine. And so that was the first time he'd been out of the United States. He's in Ireland and he's seeing Irish people starving, right, in 1845. So I think that just never left him. In the 1880s, he went back to Ireland to see all of his old friends 40 years later, the ones that were still around. And so he got very involved in Home Rule. So Douglass was speaking out on the Irish cause. And I don't know, I wonder if that rubbed off on Downing, or maybe it was the other way. Maybe Downing was really into the Irish cause, and that helped to, push Douglass to speak out. But both of them were very interested in the Irish cause. And I think for Douglass, he really saw some parallels to the experience he had as a slave, just seeing the terrible poverty that the Irish people had. He thought there was some parallels here. Okay, the second issue I want to get into is temperance. Coyle was very concerned about temperance. He wanted the Irish to gain acceptance, and he thought that the key thing holding them back was their reputation for the lack of temperance. And so, even though Newport already had a Father Matthew Hall, and now that was on Thames Street, and the Admiral Fitzroy Inn, you know where the Admiral Fitzroy Inn is? That's where this stood. And, no, it was on Thames. Yeah. And Dan and I were talking about this, we think it burned down in the 80s, we think. I think that was but so there was already a temperance hall, but he set up a second temperance hall for St. Joe's. He was totally into temperance, and he was always giving speeches about the dangers of intemperance, and he was the speaker. But on occasion, there were also national temperance lecturers who would come to Newport. So the Reverend Mahlon Van Horne shared Coyle's temperance fervor and would attend lectures in Newport. One event in 1885, Van Horne heard John St. John, former governor of Kansas, tell all about his war on the saloons in Kansas, knocking out the saloons. In the audience with Van Horne was Patrick Boyle, soon to become mayor, and Michael Butler, Irish-born gardener, very successful in gardening, floral business, and a trustee of St. Mary's Church. Excuse me. Third issue I want to talk about is suffrage. I know Keith's touched on this already a little bit, but Irish Americans are going to join hands with African Americans, and as Keith said, Rhode Island was in this unusual position in that after the Civil War, immigrants could not vote unless they had this property worth $134. African Americans could vote regardless of property, right? So we have that set up, and there's an estimate by the man who did the Rhode Island census in 1865. He said 1 in 12 Irish immigrants could meet that property requirement. So that would be about 8% were able to vote, right? So hardly anybody. Well, so you've got that, as Keith was saying too. Meanwhile, in the South, African Americans are getting disenfranchised, right? It's the African Americans who are losing the vote, the 1870s, 1880s, Jim Crow laws. They have to pay poll taxes that they can't afford. They have to pass these difficult literacy tests. And of course, you know how that worked is if you were a poor white and you couldn't pass the test, could you still vote? Yes. They call it the grandfather clause. If your grandfather could vote, you were grandfathered in, right? Even though you couldn't pass the test as a white person, right? So they found ways to keep the whites with the vote and disenfranchise blacks. So you've got that going on in the South, whereas you have African Americans with the vote in Rhode Island and a lot of Irish without the vote. So it's an interesting juxtaposition. Well, starting in the Civil War, proposals were put forth which would grant the right to vote to foreign-born veterans. If you served in the Civil War, you could get the vote regardless of whether you had property. That was the proposal. It was blocked by the Rhode Island voters. In the 1870s, Charles Gorman, an Irish-American state representative from North Providence, and he was an attorney, he really started to promote the cause vigorously, but lost again at the polls. The Providence Journal was very much against this, giving the vote to the immigrants. In 1881, an Equal Rights Association was founded and pushed for change on the issue. Newport has established a chapter in 1882 and held regular meetings. In April 1886, suffrage advocates at last succeeded in obtaining the vote for landless immigrant veterans. So finally, in 1886, if you had served in the military, you could vote, even if you didn't meet the property requirement. Encouraged by the victory, Gorman planned to hold an equal rights convention at the Colony House in Newport in July of 1886. When the delegates assembled in Newport, George Downing was chosen as chairman of the meeting. Aside from Downing, most of the representatives were Irish. However, there were French-Canadian delegates from Central Falls and a couple of German delegates from Providence. So there was a little bit of a sprinkling, but probably 90% Irish, right? But George Downing presiding over it all. Gorman delivered a major address asking the delegates to consider forming a third party because neither the Democrats nor the Republicans were helping go on the issue. But in 1888, the Bourne Amendment is passed, and this time the voters go along, and so now people could vote regardless of whether they had the property or not. And I hope I got that all right. Father Heyman's in the audience. He's the authority on all this. He's written about this a lot. And Patrick Conley's another one who's an authority on this. But anyway, maybe Father will have something to say on that. Well, in seeing George Downing at the center of his campaign, chairing these meetings at the Colony House to give immigrants the vote, I again wondered, was he just being polite? I don't know why I keep thinking this, but as I'm reading him big these things, I'm thinking, well, he's just a nice person, and he's like, yeah, I'm free, I'll go to the Colony House and sit at the meeting, right? That's kind of what I think about. So then I came across this massive reference volume. It's a volume on Newport County, and it has to be 600 to 800 pages. It's a massive volume. All sorts of details about, schools, churches, different figures. And the book included a section on the 40 leading figures of Newport County. George Downing was one of those people highlighted. They give a picture of each person. So here's what the author said. Downing's pride is centered in increasing the architectural and material beauty and prosperity of Newport. And above all, that the efforts of justice and equality in freeing the statute book of Rhode Island from all proscription to race, not stopping at the colored, but including the adopted U.S. citizen. So that's what they're putting there. So clearly this was a major concern of his. Now, the reference to beautifying Newport, too, he was key to setting up Turo Park. And of course, he lived right kind of diagonal, right, from there. And if you look, there's a stone slab in Turo Park, and it has his name on it, and several other people. But he provided, I think, the bulk of the funding to set up Toro Park. Well, by the 1890s, Downing's health was starting to fail, and so he recedes from the political scene somewhat. In 1902, the newly inaugurated president, Teddy Roosevelt, came to Newport for a baptism. His friends, the Chandlers, named their baby Theodore, and invited Teddy to be Theodore's godfather. And it was at their house, the Chandler, right, which probably everyone's familiar with, right? Regular people in the spice pear, right? Bring your checkbook, right? So after the ceremony, Roosevelt didn't really want to stick around. He sailed into Newport, went to the ceremony, and I took a carriage out, took it down Bellevue Avenue. They said, the newspaper said he just made one stop on Bellevue to meet his friend George Downing, to shake hands with him as he left the city. I think maybe he knew George Downing was at the end of his days, right? And so the following year, Downing died at his home in his 84th year. His funeral was at Emmanuel Church. His death was reported in the Newport papers, but also in the New York Times and the Boston Globe. The Globe offered a stirring tribute to George Downing. He fought bigotry no matter whom it menaced. He was an ardent friend of labor. He came to the side of the foreign-born in Rhode Island in their efforts to secure their rights. The liberty that he demanded for his race, he was more than willing to extend to others. Narrowness was never safe where George T. Downing was present. I think that's a good place to stop. So, okay, thanks very much.
That was really riveting and impactful. My takeaway from it, and everyone's going to have a different one, is that the ease of assimilation, or the lack of difficulty of assimilation for the Africans and the Irish was very, very similar with the templates and one another. In Newport, vis-a-vis Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Fascinating. We have about 5 minutes for questions, and I will walk in. Father Heyman?
More just a comment. James Coyle was the chaplain of the St. Augustine Society in Providence. St. Augustine Society is composed of black Catholics, many of whom were settled in Providence by the Freedmen's Bureau. I haven't seen very much on that, but he was the chaplain of that society. So he was friendly with the African Americans, at least in Providence. If you would check out the newspaper accounts of the notorious Kerry Hill, there is only one reference that I found between violence between African Americans and the Irish, whereas in Providence there are multiple. So on Kerry Hill, at least, where people, Africans and Americans and Irish lived close together, there was peace between the two races, which is very unusual.
Yes, I was just curious to both of you, how long do you think it took the Africans to learn English? And is there any evidence of, how it evolved? Because once the integration started with the Irish and the other people, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
No, Africa, as I said, most Africans who were brought here enslaved were young, many times under the age of 14, 13. So they almost immediately became assimilated to a household. Again, you can't think of Newport slave trade as the entity of the South. And all the time I hear about slave pens and slave markets, it really wasn't to that scale. As enslaved Africans arrived from Africa via the West Indies, they were greeted right on the dock. I mean, all the private wharfs were owned by the great merchants. It could be Lopez, it could be Bannister, whoever. And as the ship would arrive, they would go right down and take their products and goods, including the human property. So children are brought right into the household. They are to the interest, to the economic interest of the society at that time, access to education, trade skills, coming on to the religious denomination were all of an immediate interest. So children had access to education, trade skills, even more so than the larger white rural community. But again, not because master mistresses were any better or worse, but they were responding to having a well-trained, educated workforce. You also have to remember that in the 18th century, Rhode Island, along with most of Protestant New England, was going through a great awakening, where there was this new focus on bringing people back to worship, not simply being members of a parish, but your day-to-day activities. There is wholesale converting enslaved Africans into religion. You have some of the old-time Protestant ministers, from Stiles to Hopkins to Patton, and they're actually, even in the Trinity Episcopal Church with Honeyman, they're actually talking about in their diaries how many Africans they have in services, having communion, being baptized. I mean, we're talking about hundreds. His spouse is talking about having hundreds of periods of a year in his diary, having it converted and baptized. So again, if you were enslaved in the American South or the West Indies, access to religion, access to education, cohabitation would have been unlawful and unnecessary. So it's that unique circumstance that just throws people together in this very densely compacted, interdependent community that allows for levels of humanity in relationships that would take generations and civil rights laws and even wars to rectify in the rest of the country. But that's a great question.
You know anything about I live in Golden Hill Street, right across from where I live was a cemetery that go back quite a few years. I don't know, you know anything about that?
Yeah, that's
It's named the Clifton.
it's the Clifton Cemetery. It's one of a group of smaller local cemeteries.
Yeah.
Most of the African Americans are buried in the common burial ground in the Garden Lake Acre section. Some of the elite black families who could afford it are in Island Cemetery. There were 5. So George Downing, Dr. Martha Sweetling, my great-grandfather, he purchased his plot. He died in 1909 for $450 in like 1906. He purchased plots for himself, his wife, and it was supposed to be my grandmother and others. My aunts are there, great aunts are there, but my grandmother refused. She wanted to be in the common burial ground with the people. So for the most part, most people of color, at least in that 18th, 19th century, turn of the 20th century, are in the common burial ground. Then a few across the street. Certainly later on in years, you see them buried there.
One more. One street over from where I live was Quinn Street, and there was a rice house there. I knew the rice, Harry and George years ago. I just wondering, nobody lives in that.
They still own it. It's still within the family. The house at the corner of William Street and Thomas Street is today the oldest consecutively owned house by a black family in Rhode Island, one of the earliest in America. It dates back to Isaac Rice, who came from Narragansett. His father was African, his mother was Narragansett. He marries a Narragansett woman named Noka, and they built that property. And Isaac Rice was the gardener of Governor Gibbs, which is the Governor Gibbs estate today on Mill Street that faces Turtle Park. Isaac Rice is a founder of the Union Congregational Church. He's the Underground Railroad. He's a protege of Downing and such. And today, the Rice family is actually descended, is a teacher at Rhode Island College. They actually trace themselves back to the Narragansett African line, back to the early 18th century, 1705. It's fascinating. But they still own that property. That property was a part of the Underground Railroad, along with Turtle Synagogue, George Downing property that's been gone, and the Union Colored Congregational Church.
One last question for you.
Okay. Is the Union Congregational Church still in existence in Newport, and if so, where is it?
No, as populations change and people become less tied to parishes, it happens to all denominations. The Union Congregational Church ceased to exist in 1960, and its members that wanted to be Baptist moved into the Mount Olivet Baptist Church on Main Street, and when that ended in 1970-71, the Shiloh Baptist Church, which was on School Street, that ended. It all combined into what is today the Community Baptist Church on Marcus Wheaton Boulevard. So the Community Baptist Church really represents all of the early founding churches. I know the owner quite well of the Congregational Church on Division Street. It's kind of an Airbnb, like everything seems to be.
Is that where it was originally?
The original building was called the Old Salt House. That building was gifted by the First Congregational Church and Samuel Hopkins, who was a mentor to that congregation. In fact, Before the Unitarian Church in Mill Street, that was the first congregational church of Samuel Hopkins. And as it was styled like the second congregational church, which stands as a condo next to the Artillery Company on Clark Street.
Okay, okay. Been to many tours in Newport, never heard about that. It's quite a place.
Thank you very much. While I'm walking back, I'll throw one last one in. Did the Africans that returned to Africa from here, did any of them return to the United States?
It's a sad story, actually. Probably the leading African in the community at that time is a man named Okama Meraku, who came from Ananabo, which is north of Accra in Ghana. And at the age of 80, he and a Solomon Nubia, who are founders of the African Society, they helped set up the Union Congregational Church. They bring 24 Newport African American families to Boston, and they sailed on the brig line to what is Liberia. And Okama Meraku, the Newport God who was enslaved name, writes very poetically the fact that I'm 80 years old and I still can't find freedom and equality, and I want to return to Africa. Most other African Americans at that time disagreed with him. Most were now American born, they're American. I'm comfortable in Newport, Boston, Philadelphia. Why do I want to go back there? I'm not interested. The group that he took back included an entire family, the Chavis family, who lived in Kerry Hill. And they sold their home to another black family. They had 5 children from ages 1 to 10. He and his wife, they all go to Liberia. They all died of coastal fever within a year. Very similar. But they died free men and women in a free land. And the Newport Mercury wrote an article about the fact saying, this is why you don't return to Africa. This is why you should stay put and be happy where you are and safe where you are, because that's not a safe place to be.
How about a round of applause?